Churchill family. History of power, war, and mystery. The story of the Churchill family is not simply the story of one man, and it is not even just the story of British politics. It is the story of ambition carried through generations, of aristocratic bloodlines shaped by war, of personal brilliance mixed with personal destruction, and of a name that repeatedly reappears at the center of power. To understand the Churchill family is to understand how influence survives across centuries, how reputation is built through both victory and scandal, and how history remembers some figures as heroes while quietly burying the darker truths around them. At the center of this long historical thread stands the most famous Churchill of all, Winston Churchill. But his story does not begin with him. It begins long before his birth, in a world of English nobility, military service, and political maneuvering. The Churchill family line is deeply tied to the English aristocratic system, where power was not just earned, but inherited, protected, and expanded through loyalty to the crown and success on the battlefield. Early Churchills were not yet global figures, but they were already operating within a system that rewarded courage in war and intelligence in court politics. One of the earliest influential ancestors in the Churchill line was Sir Winston Churchill of the 17th century, a royalist soldier and politician during the English Civil War. He was known for his loyalty to King Charles I, fighting against the parliamentarian forces during a period when England itself was divided into ideological and military chaos. His life established a pattern that would echo through generations: loyalty, conflict, and political risk. This early Churchill was not merely a soldier. He was also a writer and historian, showing that the family carried both intellectual and military traditions. That combination would become a defining feature of the Churchill legacy: brains and battle, words and war, history and action. As centuries passed, the Churchill family did not remain in the shadows. They remained connected to the evolving British state, adapting to new political structures while preserving their aristocratic identity. Their name became associated with service to the nation, particularly in military and colonial administration roles. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, the Churchills were fully embedded in the British elite system. They were not just participants in history, they were shaping it in smaller but significant ways through military service, governance, and strategic marriages that preserved their status. But the true transformation of the Churchill family into modern political mythology begins with the marriage that connects aristocratic tradition to explosive political ambition. Lady Randolph Churchill, born Jenny Jerome, an American socialite, married Lord Randolph Churchill, a rising British politician. This union is critical to understanding the future of the family because it brought together American wealth, British aristocratic lineage, and political ambition in a way that reshaped the next generation. Lord Randolph Churchill was intelligent, ambitious, and politically bold. He rose quickly in British politics, becoming Chancellor of the Exchequer, one of the most powerful positions in government. But his career was unstable, marked by political conflict and sudden resignation, a pattern that suggested brilliance without long-term control. It is within this volatile environment that the most important figure of the entire Churchill legacy was born. Winston Churchill entered the world not as a destined hero, but as a child surrounded by emotional distance, aristocratic expectations, and the pressure of legacy. He was born into privilege, but not comfort. His relationship with his parents was distant, particularly with his father, whose political career was already declining. This emotional distance would shape Winston's personality profoundly. He developed a strong desire for approval, recognition, and historical significance. At the same time, he developed resilience, independence, and a willingness to take risks that others avoided. His early life was marked by education struggles and a sense of being underestimated. Yet within this underestimation lay the foundation of his future identity. The idea that he would prove others wrong, that he would rise beyond expectations, and that his name would eventually define an era. The Churchill family at this point was still aristocratic, still influential, but not yet legendary. That transformation required crisis. It required war. It required global conflict that would test leadership at the highest level. And that is exactly what history would deliver. As Europe moved toward instability in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the world was unknowingly preparing the stage for the defining moment of the Churchill legacy. The British Empire was at its height, but internally fragile. Political tensions were rising, new powers were emerging, and the illusion of permanent imperial dominance was beginning to crack. Winston Churchill entered public life during this unstable transition. He began as a soldier, then a war correspondent, and eventually a politician. His early career was controversial, marked by bold decisions, shifting political alliances, and a reputation for being both brilliant and unpredictable. He served in multiple government positions before the world reached its breaking point. But even before becoming Prime Minister, Churchill had already built a reputation as a man who believed deeply in British power, naval strength, and imperial survival. At the same time, he was also a man capable of political reinvention. He shifted between parties, adapted to changing political climates, and positioned himself strategically within the evolving structure of British governance. But none of this yet defines his ultimate role. That role would only emerge when the world collapsed into global war. The Churchill family legacy, at this point in history, was still incomplete. It had aristocratic roots, political ambition, military involvement, and intellectual contribution. But it had not yet faced the ultimate test, existential war that would determine the fate of nations. That moment would arrive soon, and when it did, it would transform the Churchill name into something far larger than a family history. It would become a symbol of resistance, survival, and leadership under extreme pressure. And it would redefine not only Winston Churchill, but the entire historical meaning of the Churchill lineage. The Churchill name did not rise into global significance through comfort or stability. It rose through conflict, controversy, and constant testing of character in moments when history itself was unstable. After the early foundations of aristocratic identity and political ambition, the next phase of the Churchill story begins with the rise of Winston Churchill as a public figure who was no longer just the son of a declining politician, but a man beginning to carve out his own unpredictable path through British imperial politics. His entry into public life was not smooth or carefully controlled. It was aggressive, fast-moving, and often divisive. Churchill did not behave like a traditional politician who followed cautious steps. Instead, he moved through institutions like a force of disruption, constantly shifting between military service, journalism, and parliamentary politics. One of the earliest defining stages of his career came through military involvement and war reporting. Churchill believed that political credibility could not be separated from direct experience of war. This belief pushed him toward conflict zones where he could observe battles firsthand and shape public narratives through writing. His involvement in the Boer War in South Africa became one of the first major turning points in his public image. During this conflict, Churchill worked as a war correspondent, but his experience went far beyond observation. He was captured during military operations and famously escaped, an event that transformed him into a public figure almost overnight. That escape was not just a personal survival story, it became political capital. It gave him visibility, credibility, and a sense of heroic identity in the eyes of the British public. In an era where empire and warfare defined national pride, Churchill's escape symbolized resilience and determination. But beneath this rising fame, contradictions were already forming. Churchill was not universally admired. His views on empire, military force, and colonial governance were deeply aligned with imperial ideology, which would later become controversial in historical analysis. At the same time, his political style was often seen as unstable. He changed parties, shifted positions, and sometimes made decisions that placed him at odds with established political structures. Yet this instability did not destroy his career. Instead, it defined it. Because Churchill was not a politician who succeeded through consistency, he succeeded through adaptation. As he entered Parliament more firmly, Churchill began to build a reputation as a speaker with exceptional rhetorical power. His speeches were not just political arguments, they were performances of conviction. He used language as a weapon, shaping public opinion through emotional force and historical framing. At this stage, the Churchill family name was transitioning from aristocratic background into active political mythology. The influence of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, still lingered in memory, but Winston was no longer defined by inheritance. He was becoming defined by action. His early political career included multiple ministerial roles, each exposing him to different aspects of governance, trade, home affairs, and colonial administration. In each position, he demonstrated a mix of intelligence, ambition, and controversy. But the true test had not yet arrived. Before the world reached total war, Churchill experienced another defining period during the First World War. This conflict would become one of the most important chapters in shaping both his political reputation and his historical legacy. During this time, Churchill held significant government responsibility, including roles related to naval power and military strategy. He strongly advocated for modernizing the British Navy, believing that naval dominance was essential to maintaining the British Empire's global position. However, one of the most controversial moments of his early political career occurred during the Gallipoli campaign. This military operation, aimed at securing control of strategic territory during World War I, ended in failure and heavy losses. Churchill, who had been a key supporter of the strategy, faced severe political backlash. His reputation suffered, and he was forced to resign from his position. This moment marked one of the lowest points in his career. Many political figures would not recover from such a public failure. In Churchill's case, it created a period of isolation and political decline. He was criticized, removed from high office, and partially excluded from major decision-making circles. For a time, it appeared that his political career might end in failure rather than legacy. But this phase of decline became essential to his transformation, because the Churchill story is not one of uninterrupted success. It is a story of collapse followed by return. During the years away from top political power, Churchill continued to write, speak, and analyze global developments. He observed the rising tensions in Europe, the instability of post-war settlements, and the gradual emergence of new ideological threats that would later reshape the world. This period of reflection, often underestimated in historical summaries, allowed Churchill to refine his understanding of global conflict. He was not in power, but he was not inactive. He was preparing mentally and intellectually for a future crisis that few fully anticipated at the time. Meanwhile, the Churchill family name remained tied to both prestige and controversy. Aristocratic legacy still provided social position, but political influence depended entirely on survival in a rapidly changing world. As Europe moved deeper into instability between the wars, Churchill's warnings about rising threats were often ignored or dismissed. Many political leaders preferred stability over confrontation, while Churchill increasingly focused on military preparedness and strategic foresight. This divergence between him and mainstream political opinion created isolation, but also positioned him as a figure who would later appear right before the crisis. History, however, does not reward foresight immediately. It rewards it only when events confirm it. And that confirmation was still ahead. At this stage of the Churchill family narrative, a pattern becomes clear. The family's rise is not linear, it is cyclical. It moves through phases of ascent, collapse, recovery, and transformation. This cycle is what ultimately prepares the ground for Winston Churchill's greatest historical role. But before that moment arrives, the world itself must fall into a conflict greater than anything seen before. And when that happens, the Churchill name will no longer be just a political identity. It will become a symbol of wartime leadership under existential threat. The interwar years were not peaceful in the true sense of the word. They were quiet on the surface, but underneath that calm was a slow rebuilding of tensions that would eventually reshape the entire world order. For Winston Churchill, this period became one of the most politically isolating phases of his life, but also one of the most defining in terms of foresight and historical positioning. After the failure and controversy of the First World War's Gallipoli campaign, Churchill was not viewed as a reliable central authority in British politics. His reputation had been damaged, and trust among senior political figures had weakened significantly. He remained in Parliament, but for a long time he was outside the core circle of decision-making power. This is where the Churchill narrative begins to take a different shape. Not as a man in control of events, but as a man observing them from the margins, increasingly convinced that the world was heading toward another catastrophic conflict. As Europe entered the 1920s and 1930s, new political ideologies began to rise. Economic instability after the First World War created fertile ground for radical movements. Governments struggled to maintain stability, and societies were deeply unsettled by financial crises, political uncertainty, and unresolved tensions from the Treaty of Versailles. During this time, Churchill began to focus heavily on warnings about future threats. He paid close attention to developments in Germany, Italy, and other parts of Europe, where authoritarian movements were gaining influence. He was particularly alarmed by the rise of aggressive nationalism and military expansionism. While many political leaders in Britain preferred policies of avoidance and diplomatic restraint, Churchill increasingly argued that ignoring these developments would lead to disaster. But his warnings were not widely accepted. In fact, during much of the 1930s, Churchill was politically sidelined. Many considered his positions too extreme or overly pessimistic. His calls for military rearmament were seen by some as unnecessary escalation, while others believed that diplomatic engagement could prevent another war entirely. This created a deep divide between Churchill and the dominant political mindset of the time. While he focused on warning about future danger, much of the political establishment focused on avoiding immediate conflict at almost any cost. This difference in perspective placed him in a difficult position. He was neither fully trusted nor fully ignored, but instead positioned in a kind of political isolation where his influence was limited. Yet history was quietly shifting in the direction he had warned about. As the 1930s progressed, Germany began rearming and expanding its military capacity under rising authoritarian leadership. This transformation marked a turning point in European stability. It was no longer a theoretical concern. It was becoming a visible and accelerating reality. Churchill observed these developments with increasing urgency. He argued that Britain's lack of preparation could become fatal if conflict erupted. He repeatedly emphasized the importance of strengthening air defense, modernizing military infrastructure, and abandoning complacency. Still, his warnings did not immediately change policy. Instead, the dominant political strategy remained one of appeasement, a belief that limited concessions might prevent large-scale war. This approach temporarily reduced tensions but ultimately allowed further escalation by aggressive regimes. Churchill strongly opposed this strategy. He believed it underestimated the scale of the threat and misread the intentions of rising powers. His position was controversial because it challenged not only foreign policy decisions but also the psychological desire of a nation still recovering from the trauma of the First World War. Britain, like much of Europe, did not want another war. The memory of trenches, mass casualties, and economic devastation was still fresh. Many political leaders prioritized peace above preparedness. Churchill, however, argued that peace without strength was temporary. This disagreement defined much of his political isolation during the pre-war years. As tensions continued to escalate across Europe, Churchill's speeches and writings increasingly reflected a sense of urgency. He framed global developments as part of a larger historical pattern where failure to act early would result in far greater destruction later. At the same time, his personal political position remained unstable. He had changed party affiliations earlier in his career, and although he remained a member of Parliament, he was not part of the central governing leadership. This meant that when decisions were being made about foreign policy and military readiness, Churchill was often outside the room. Yet outside the room, he was becoming increasingly certain that war was unavoidable. By the late 1930s, events began to validate his warnings. The annexation of territories, the breakdown of diplomatic agreements, and the rapid expansion of military forces across Europe signaled that the fragile peace was collapsing. The turning point came when it became clear that a large-scale European war was no longer hypothetical. It was imminent. At this moment, Churchill's long period of political isolation began to reverse. Because when crisis becomes undeniable, voices that were once dismissed often become necessary again. The Churchill family name, which had survived cycles of political rise and decline, was now approaching its most critical moment in modern history. The stage was set for global war. And with it, the transformation of Winston Churchill from a controversial political figure into a central leader of national survival. But that transformation would not be gradual. It would be explosive. By the end of the 1930s, Europe was no longer sliding toward war. It was already inside its early stages of collapse. Diplomatic systems were breaking down, military expansions were accelerating, and the fragile belief that another global conflict could be avoided was disappearing rapidly. For Winston Churchill, this moment was the turning point where decades of warnings, isolation, and political rejection suddenly converged into relevance. He had spent years arguing that appeasement would fail, that rising authoritarian regimes would not stop at negotiated boundaries, and that Britain's lack of preparation would become a critical weakness. Now, those warnings were no longer theoretical. They were becoming reality. When war finally broke out in 1939, Britain entered a new era of uncertainty and immediate danger. The early months of the conflict were marked by confusion, rapid military developments, and a lack of clear long-term strategy. At this stage, Churchill was not yet Prime Minister, but he was already returning to a position of influence. His long-standing criticism of government policy suddenly appeared more accurate, and his calls for military readiness gained renewed attention. The political leadership of Britain initially remained under figures who had supported diplomatic restraint in the previous years. However, as the situation deteriorated and military pressure increased, it became clear that leadership required change. In 1940, as the war expanded dramatically across Europe and Britain faced increasing threat, a critical political transition took place. Churchill was appointed Prime Minister. This moment marked one of the most significant turning points not only in his life, but in the entire Churchill family legacy. A man who had been politically sidelined for years was now placed at the absolute center of national survival. The timing was not symbolic. It was structural necessity. Britain was facing a direct existential crisis. France was collapsing under military pressure. European alliances were breaking apart, and Britain stood increasingly isolated against a rapidly advancing enemy force. The situation reached its most critical point when Britain found itself effectively alone in resistance. This period became one of the most defining phases of the war, where national survival depended not only on military strength, but on psychological resilience. Churchill's leadership style during this time was direct, forceful, and emotionally charged. His speeches became a central element of national morale. He did not simply describe events. He framed them as existential struggles between survival and defeat. His language carried weight because it was rooted in urgency. He spoke of endurance, resistance, and the refusal to surrender under extreme pressure. These messages were not abstract political statements. They were psychological tools aimed at sustaining national unity during crisis. At the same time, military realities were extremely harsh. Britain faced sustained aerial attacks, infrastructure damage, and constant uncertainty about invasion risk. The country was under pressure from both military and psychological fronts. Churchill's role during this period extended beyond political leadership. He became a symbolic figure of resistance, representing the idea that collapse was not inevitable even under overwhelming pressure. However, leadership during war is never purely inspirational. It also involves difficult decisions, strategic compromises, and constant evaluation of military outcomes. Churchill worked closely with military advisors, international allies, and domestic institutions to coordinate defense and long-term strategy. As the war expanded, alliances became essential. Britain's survival depended not only on internal resilience but on external support and coordination with other major powers engaged in the conflict. The Churchill family name, at this point, was no longer just tied to British aristocratic tradition or political legacy. It had become globally recognized as a symbol of wartime leadership under extreme pressure. Yet even at the height of his authority, Churchill remained a controversial figure. His decisions were debated, his strategies were analyzed, and his leadership style was both praised and criticized. But in moments of crisis, effectiveness often outweighs consensus. What mattered most was that Britain did not collapse. As the war continued, momentum gradually shifted. Early defensive struggles evolved into broader strategic resistance. International alliances strengthened, and the balance of global conflict began to change. Churchill's role evolved with it. He was no longer only managing survival. He was now contributing to long-term victory planning, coordination between allied nations, and the shaping of post-war expectations. But the war itself was not yet close to ending. And within the Churchill family narrative, this phase represents not conclusion, but transformation under pressure at the highest possible level. The legacy being built during this time would define how the world remembers not only Winston Churchill, but the entire idea of leadership during existential crisis. As World War II moved beyond its earliest and most uncertain phase, the conflict stopped being only about survival and became a complex global struggle of strategy, alliances, and long-term planning. For Winston Churchill, this stage marked a shift from emergency leadership to coordinated global wartime direction. Britain was no longer standing alone in isolation. Instead, it was now part of a widening alliance system that would determine the future of the entire world order. The early fear of national collapse had not disappeared completely, but it had been replaced by a more structured kind of warfare. Military coordination improved. Resources were shared across allied nations and strategic planning became more unified. Churchill's role in this phase was not limited to speeches or symbolic leadership. He became deeply involved in high-level strategic discussions with allied leaders focusing on timing, military priorities, and the balance between different theaters of war. One of the defining features of this period was the growing partnership between Britain and the United States. This alliance became essential to sustaining long-term resistance and eventually shifting the balance of power. Churchill understood that victory would not come quickly. It would require endurance, industrial strength, and coordinated military pressure across multiple fronts. His leadership focused heavily on maintaining unity among allies whose priorities were not always identical. At the same time, the war expanded further into a truly global conflict. Battles were no longer concentrated in one region of Europe. Instead, multiple continents became active zones of military engagement involving complex supply chains, naval power, and coordinated ground operations. Within this environment, Churchill often acted as both strategist and communicator. Internally, he worked with military advisors to evaluate risks, plan operations, and allocate resources. Externally, he maintained public morale through speeches that emphasized determination, resilience, and long-term victory. His communication style during this phase remained consistent with earlier wartime leadership: direct, emotionally powerful, and historically framed. He often presented the war not just as a military conflict, but as a defining moment in civilization's trajectory. But behind the public image, the reality of wartime leadership was far more complex. Decisions had to be made with incomplete information, under extreme pressure, and with consequences that could affect millions of lives. Churchill's leadership during this time included both successes and difficult strategic debates. Some military operations achieved significant progress, while others faced criticism or required adjustment. This duality is an unavoidable aspect of wartime command at the highest level. As the war progressed, planning for a decisive turning point became central to Allied strategy. Military leaders began focusing on large-scale coordinated operations designed to push back enemy forces on multiple fronts simultaneously. One of the most important strategic developments of this phase was the preparation for a major continental operation that would eventually become one of the most significant military invasions in modern history. This operation required not only military precision, but also extensive political coordination between allied nations. Logistics, timing, deception strategies, and resource allocation all had to be synchronized across multiple governments and military command structures. Churchill was deeply involved in these discussions, balancing urgency with caution. He understood the potential risks of failure, but also recognized that delay carried its own dangers. The pressure to act decisively increased as the war reached a critical turning point. Meanwhile, on the broader global stage, the balance of power was slowly shifting. Industrial capacity, military coordination, and resource mobilization were increasingly favoring the Allied forces. However, victory was still not guaranteed. Wars of this scale often changed direction unpredictably, and leadership decisions remained crucial. At the same time, the human cost of the war continued to grow. Entire cities were affected, populations were displaced, and the psychological impact of prolonged conflict shaped an entire generation. Churchill's leadership during this period reflected a constant tension between strategic calculation and human awareness. He was not only managing military outcomes, but also navigating the emotional and psychological weight of global conflict. The Churchill family name, at this stage, was fully embedded in world history. It was no longer just a British political lineage. It had become associated with one of the most significant global conflicts in human civilization. Yet even as momentum began to shift toward eventual victory, uncertainty remained. The outcome of war is never fully predictable until the final stages are reached. The final phase of World War II was not a sudden moment of victory, but a gradual collapse of a global conflict system that had consumed nations, economies, and generations. By this stage, the war had already reshaped political borders, destroyed entire cities, and permanently altered the balance of world power. For Winston Churchill, this was the period where leadership shifted from survival to conclusion, from resistance to resolution, and from wartime urgency to post-war uncertainty. The large-scale Allied operations that had been carefully planned in earlier stages now unfolded across multiple fronts. Military pressure increased steadily, forcing opposing forces into retreat and fragmentation, Supply lines weakened, coordination broke down, and the structural advantages of the Allied powers became increasingly decisive. At the center of Allied coordination, Churchill worked alongside other major wartime leaders, managing both military strategy and political negotiation. These relationships were complex, shaped by shared objectives, but also differing visions of the post-war world. As the war moved toward its final collapse, attention gradually shifted from battlefield outcomes to what would come next. Even before victory was fully secured, discussions were already underway about rebuilding nations, restructuring political systems, and preventing future global conflicts of similar scale. Churchill's position during this time was unique. He was still a wartime leader, but he was also becoming a transitional figure, someone who had guided a nation through existential crisis and would soon have to face the consequences of peace. The final defeat of opposing forces marked the end of the largest global conflict in human history. Up to that point, the victory was not attributed to a single leader or nation, but to a combination of industrial capacity, military coordination, alliances, and sustained endurance under extreme pressure. When the war finally ended, the world that emerged was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before it began. Empires weakened, new superpowers emerged, and international institutions were created to manage global stability in a new way. For Churchill, the end of the war brought both recognition and transition. He was widely acknowledged as one of the central figures of wartime leadership, a symbol of resistance during Britain's most vulnerable moment. His speeches, decisions, and leadership style had become part of global historical memory. But political life does not end with victory. In the post-war period, leadership is tested in a different way, through reconstruction, domestic governance, and adapting to a rapidly changing world order. Churchill eventually returned to political leadership after the war, but the environment had changed. The priorities of society were no longer centered on survival, but on rebuilding, welfare, and long-term stability. This shift created a new political landscape where wartime leadership did not automatically translate into peacetime consensus. Despite this, his legacy remained deeply embedded in modern history. The Churchill family name had completed its transformation from aristocratic lineage to political force, from imperial-era influence to global wartime symbolism, and finally to historical legacy. Yet the story of the Churchill family is not defined only by one man or one era. It represents a broader pattern of how power evolves across generations, how families interact with historical forces, and how individual leadership can become inseparable from global events. Mystery in the Churchill legacy does not come from hidden secrets alone. It comes from interpretation. Different generations read the same events differently. Some see heroic leadership. Others see imperial complexity. Some see decisive strategy. Others see political controversy. And this tension is part of why the Churchill name continues to remain relevant in historical discussion, even long after the events themselves have ended. In the end, the Churchill family story is not simply about war or politics. It is about how history creates figures who become larger than themselves, and how those figures are remembered differently depending on the lens of time. Power rises. War reshapes it. Mystery remains in interpretation, and legacy becomes permanent, comes